Hi, my name's Lily, and today I'm going to be talking to you about sea level rise, its impacts, and mitigations. So to begin, I wanted to start off by asking those questions I know we all have. What is sea level rise? Sea level rise is an increase in the level of the world's oceans due to the effects of global climate change. And how is something like this measured? Well, in the 1880s and early 1990s, it was measured by tide gauges, but now satellites carry out this task by bouncing radar signals off the ocean's surface. And due to local weather conditions and other factors affecting sea level, measurements are taken globally and then averaged out. And more importantly, do emissions matter? Current and future emissions both matter. About 2 feet of sea level rise along the U.S. coastline is increasing between 2020 and 2100 because of emissions. And failing to curb future emissions could cause an additional 4 to 7 feet of increase by the end of this century. What do sea level rise impacts look like? Well, sea level rise poses a serious threat to coastal life all around the world, and consequences include increased intensity of storm surges, flooding, and damage to coastal ecosystems. And usually this is where population centers are located, in addition to fragile wildlife habitats. People are often displaced and seek safer homes, and they move further inland, but these areas are also threatened because rising seas can contaminate soil and groundwater with salt. By 2100, up to 410 million people could be at risk from coastal flooding as the warming climate expands the ocean, causing sea levels to rise. Sea level rise will create a profound shift in coastal flooding over the next 30 years by causing tide and storm surge heights to increase and reach further inland. By 2050, moderate flooding that causes typical damage is expected to occur on average more than 10 times as often as it does today. So, a real-life example of a county facing sea level rise impacts today and trying to overcome barriers and challenges is Cape May County. The distribution of land use of Cape May County was compared to the flood exposure map and established 35% of developed areas fell well within the high-risk zone, with the risk of infrastructure and people face in high-hazard flooding zone increasing by 105%. Authors stated that a community's survival is dependent upon the capacity of services local facilities can provide, for example, schools, hospitals, and rescue departments. And an indicator of vulnerability can be seen in the number of critical facilities residing in these high-risk zones. So using this as an example to explain some barriers and how to overcome them and definitely expand upon, that is what I would like to continue talking about in this presentation. So first, looking at vulnerability assessment. This was used within a case study that was founded upon Cambridge's Alewife Preparedness Plan. And with using a vulnerability assessment, results and just after phase 1 suggested that the study area needed to take immediate action for the most likely climate scenarios the city faces. And the reasoning behind this was based off of uneven preparation for climate threats within different levels of organizations. For example, the Elderly Center had plans for a heat crisis, but for no other crisis, and managers, especially upper-level staff, stated that they were not fully aware of protocols established, nor properly trained on location or usage of emergency equipment. So, as seen in Cape May County, and also not having enough facility areas out of high-risk flooding zones, using a vulnerability assessment could potentially provide some insight. Leading on to education and awareness, authors found that education was a key factor in an individual's appreciation and knowledge for climate change. Within a current study, focused on 29 districts within the capital of Vietnam, results suggested that the majority of the population knew about climate change, but there was definitely a higher response in educated neighborhoods than in non-educated neighborhoods. And within those educated neighborhoods, individuals associated climate change with terminology such as increasing temperature, sea level rise, and consequences for humans that could be detrimental. So it was definitely found that education and awareness can help with sea level rise, and I definitely think that was also true to say for Cape May County and the vulnerability assessment, and for those upper level staff just knowing better and what they can do in times of crises. Moving on to a more ecological mitigation effort. This study looked at salt marshes and nitrogen pollution. So sea level rise can also impact agricultural areas, which promote nitrogen pollution and runoff into waterways that empty into oceans, and Nelson and Zavaleta were the first to assess this interaction between the two by measuring plant growth and nitrogen storage responses to flooding to understand the impacts of this ecosystem, and results suggested that coastal marshes can catch nitrogen and act as a coastal filter, protecting the ocean from the abundancy of nitrogen sourced from the land. Finally, moving on to sea level rise scenarios, and especially high-end estimates, and using this over climate-based models. One of the ongoing effects of anthropogenic climate change is sea level rise, and estimations of sea level rise aid in policy analysis, planning, and the management of impacts. High-end sea level rise estimations offer insight into the distribution of sea level rise that climate models do not, and they do take into account the glaciers and ice sheets still intact in Greenland and Antarctica today. So results state that high-end projections suggest that temperature has a large impact on sea level rise, with scenarios within 2100 and 2300, and projections also indicate that ocean processes such as glacial melting that are slower provide just even more reason for mitigation efforts, because people seriously do not understand how high the sea can rise whenever these things melt. So finally, the future research for sea level rise should continue to use tide gauges as well as satellites, should definitely focus more on education and public outreach, using sea level rise scenarios that use the high-end estimate models rather than climate-based models, and mapping and analyzing these areas so that we can predict areas that will have higher flood risks and areas that are more prone to flooding and increased storm surges, so that the general public is aware of what is going on through climate change and sea level rise. Thank you.